Just a floor nurse. That was how Dr. Sterling described Megan O'Brien during his morning rounds at Mercy General in Denver, his voice carrying the particular disdain he reserved for people he'd already decided didn't matter. 3 months. She'd been working here for 3 months, and in that time she'd learned exactly how invisible a competent person could become if they kept their mouth shut and their eyes down. The Denver facility sprawled across 12 stories of stainless steel and fluorescent hum, the kind of hospital where the air itself smelled like antiseptic and broken promises. Megan moved through it like water through a sieve, present enough to do the work, absent enough to never be remembered. Her scrubs were always pristine. Her badge clipped to her waistband held a photo where she'd deliberately chosen an expression somewhere between blank and apologetic. Her name tag read M. the Bryan, floor nurse, which was technically accurate in the way that a biography written in 2 words could be technically accurate. She'd learned to compress herself into the spaces between other people's ambitions. The surgical wing where she spent most of her shifts hummed with a particular energy, the kind of controlled chaos that existed only in places where life and death negotiated their terms every 4 hours. Dr. Sterling commanded this space the way a conductor commands an orchestra, his presence making the air pressure change, his movements precise and economical and utterly devoid of uncertainty. He was 53, maybe 54, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and silver hair that made him look distinguished in the way that money and genetics conspired to make certain men look distinguished. His Rolex caught the light every time he gestured, and he gestured constantly, a habit born from decades of knowing that people would watch whatever direction his hand moved. This morning, like most mornings, he barely glanced at Megan as he passed her in the corridor outside room 312. She was adjusting the flow rate on a post-op patient, her movements economical and certain, but Dr. Sterling's eyes moved right through her as if she were part of the infrastructure, no different from the beeping monitors or the rolling carts. Floor nurses, she'd heard him say once to a resident, the dismissiveness in his tone suggesting they were a necessary inconvenience, like janitors or billing clerks. She didn't react. Reactions required the luxury of caring how people perceived you. What Dr. Sterling didn't see, what almost no one saw, was the precision embedded in every movement she made. The way her hands never trembled during 4 placements, even on patients with collapsed veins who'd been stuck 8 times in emergency rooms across 3 states. The way she positioned the crash cart in room 314 before anyone had asked for it, muscle memory pulling her toward the door the exact moment the monitor's rhythm began to spiral. The way her feet placed themselves on the floor with the kind of weight distribution that came from years of standing in spaces where standing still for 6 hours wasn't a possibility, it was a requirement. The pair of worn combat boots she kept hidden in her locker, shoved into the bottom corner behind her personal belongings, told a different story. They were desert tan, faded almost to gray in places, with a scuff mark on the left heel where a .50 caliber round had creased it during a supply run outside Fallujah in a year she didn't let herself think about anymore. The boots were retired now, too damaged for active use, and she'd brought them here, to Mercy General, to Denver, to this new life, the way other people might bring photographs or wedding rings. They were the only artifact of a previous existence she'd allowed herself to keep. She touched them sometimes, when the supply closet was empty and the shift had been particularly loud. The morning rounds continued with the precision of theater. Dr. Sterling walked the surgical floor with his entourage, 2 residents trailing slightly behind, a nurse manager taking notes, a medical student recording information on an iPad. Megan stepped aside when they approached, making herself smaller, letting the wall absorb her. This was what 3 months had taught her: invisibility was safety. Invisibility meant no questions. No attention. No eyes looking too closely at the scar tissue on her forearms, which she always covered with long sleeves despite the Denver heat. Room 314 held Marcus Wellington, a 71-year-old male admitted 3 days ago for a planned cardiac catheterization that had gone sideways somewhere between the angiogram and the recovery protocols. His heart had been compensating for 30 years with a valve that was slowly failing, and this morning it had apparently decided to stop compensating altogether. Megan had checked on him at 6:06 a.m. His vitals had been stable then. Baseline. Unremarkable. At 7:23 a.m., his heart monitor began to scream. She heard it before she was consciously aware of moving, some part of her nervous system that predated civilian life recognizing the urgency in that particular electronic wail. The monitor showed a chaotic rhythm, the kind of heartbeat that was technically a heartbeat in the way that a car spinning out of control was technically still driving. Ventricular fibrillation. VFib. The heart had stopped coordinating and started instead to simply quiver, uselessly, fatally. Megan was in room 314 before the first code announcement came through the intercom. Her hands were already reaching for the crash cart. The defibrillator pads were already in her grip. The world had narrowed to the space between one breath and the next, and everything that followed came from muscle memory that hadn't been exercised in 3 months but had been seared into her nervous system over 18 years. Patient's unresponsive, no pulse, she said to the monitor as much as to anyone else, her voice steady in a way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with training that had become part of her cellular structure. Starting compressions. She positioned herself at the bedside, the heel of her hand finding the precise spot on the sternum, 2 finger widths above the xiphoid process, the location burned into her from countless field operations where getting it wrong meant someone died who didn't have to. She began compressions at a rate that matched the rhythm of a song in her head, a song that all field medics knew, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, the beat of survival. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook when the work was happening. By the time Dr. Chen arrived, the surgical resident who'd been making morning rounds in the adjacent bay, Megan had already been working the code for 40 seconds. She'd positioned the patient, prepped the defibrillator, assessed airway patency, and was midway through the second cycle of compressions when she glanced up and saw recognition flicker across his face. Dr. Chen was young, maybe 32, with the kind of careful attention in his eyes that suggested he'd learned his medicine in places where the textbook didn't apply. He watched her for exactly 1 second, watched the angle of her shoulders, the depth of her compressions, the way she'd already begun to position the airway equipment without anyone asking for it. He watched her and something in his expression shifted. "Continue compressions," he said, moving to the medication station, his voice carrying that particular tone of respect that came from actually understanding what he was seeing. "Good placement. Keep the rhythm at 100 per minute." "Copy," Megan said, which was wrong. Nurses didn't say copy in civilian hospitals, that was military radio protocol, but the word was already out of her mouth and she couldn't pull it back. The compressions continued. O2 sat climbing. The monitor showing the steady cadence of a heart that was being artificially kept alive, waiting for either chemical intervention or electrical reset to pull it back into sinus rhythm. Dr. Chen pushed epinephrine, 1 mg for push, and the medication made the usual journey toward the myocardium, a chemical messenger carrying the only prayer available in this exact moment. 1 cycle. 2 cycles. The rhythm began to change on the monitor, the chaotic VFib beginning to organize itself, finding a pattern, finding a pulse. Sinus rhythm, Megan said, her hand still compressed on the chest, verifying by palpating the carotid artery. Pulse is present. The room exhaled. The code alert was called off. The status shifted from emergency to critical but salvageable, which in hospital terms meant the difference between death and survival, a line so thin that 3 months ago she'd walked away from being someone who made that line her entire purpose. Dr. Chen was still watching her. She could feel his attention the way you could feel a laser sight on your skin. It had weight, it had presence, it had the quality of someone who'd seen something he hadn't expected to see. His eyes moved from her face to her hands, which were still steady despite the adrenaline, and then back to her face again. "What field hospital did you train at?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "That technique, the compression rhythm, the airway positioning, I've only seen that done in Baghdad." He paused. "Where did you serve?" The moment crystallized. Everything stopped moving except her heart, which suddenly remembered how to race. The question hung in the air between them like something that had weight and teeth. She could feel the recognition in his eyes, the way he'd connected dots that she'd been very careful to keep separate, and her hands, the hands that had just stayed perfectly steady while running a code, began to tremble. But not where he could see. She pulled away from the bedside with a single smooth motion, already moving toward the door, already creating distance. "I need to check on the patients in 310 and 312, she said, her voice back to the flat, unremarkable tone that was her primary tool here at Mercy General. The tone that belonged to a floor nurse named Emma Bryan, not to anyone who'd spent 18 years being called senior chief, not to anyone who'd held intestines in bare hands while mortars fell around her, not to anyone worth remembering. She was in the supply closet before her hands gave up their pretense of steadiness. The metal shelves around her hummed with the indifferent drone of hospital existence. She pressed her palms flat against the cool stainless steel of the bottom shelf, the shelf where she kept the boots, and she traced the scar where the bullet had creased the leather. Just one of countless scars, she thought. Just one of the countless stories that were supposed to stay buried. 3 months of invisibility had bought her exactly 3 months of peace. It was 7:11 a.m. on a Tuesday, and she'd just given up the most important thing she'd worked toward in the 6 months of planning her exit from her previous life, the complete and total absence of questions. The complete and total erasure of anyone looking too carefully. Dr. Chen had seen her. And worse, he'd known exactly what he was seeing. The staff meeting erupted in laughter when Dr. Sterling announced his bet. His Rolex glinted as he gestured dismissively at Megan, still seated 3 rows back, her pen steady on her notepad. "I'll give her a week," he said, voice dripping with amusement. "Maybe less. Look at this timid little floor nurse, she probably faints at the sight of blood." He wrote the wager amounts on the whiteboard in his precise script: $500 from cardiology, $300 from orthopedics, $250 from general surgery. 3 separate physicians took the bet, laughing, shaking their heads at the easy money. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and institutional carpet. Megan took one measured breath. She did not raise her hand. She did not object. She simply wrote a single word on her notepad, noted, and turned the page. 2 days later, the cafeteria fell silent. Dr. Sterling walked past her table during lunch, and his elbow connected with her tray with the precision of a surgeon's cut. Not accidental. 20 staff members saw him change trajectory, saw his smile. Chicken soup exploded across the tile floor, spreading in a golden arc. Her sandwich scattered. The surgical team 3 tables away stopped eating. They watched. Everyone watched. Dr. Sterling dropped a patient chart at her feet, papers fanning across the wet floor like dying birds. He did his smirk, the one he'd perfected over 17 years of never facing consequences. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Some of us have actual medical work to do." His voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who'd never seen himself reflected in another person's eyes and found anything lacking. The cafeteria was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming above the drop ceiling. Megan stood slowly. One tear escaped down her right cheek. Just one. Her hand rose, steady as a surgical laser, and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with him. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Not louder. Quieter. The kind of quiet that made the room's air pressure shift. "I've held intestines in my bare hands while mortars fell around me. Doctor, your tantrums don't even register." The words hung between them like shrapnel suspended in smoke. Dr. Sterling's face flushed crimson. He forced a laugh, a sound like metal scraping concrete, but the laugh died in the cafeteria's expanding silence. "Big talk from someone who'll be gone by Friday," he said, and walked away, but his stride was no longer smooth. It was rushed. That night, the rain hammered the parking lot like applause, and Dr. Chen found Megan in the stairwell, her shoulders against the concrete wall between the 3rd and 4th floors. She wasn't crying. She was staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Where did you serve?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the stairwell, and Megan's jaw tightened for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked away without answering, her footsteps echoing down the stairs with the measured cadence of someone trained to move through hostile territory. Chen watched her go and understood. He'd seen that gait before, in his cousin who'd served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, in his roommate from medical school who'd been a combat medic. He'd seen it in the way her hands had moved during the code. Not nervous. Not uncertain. Experienced. Muscle memory that came from somewhere far older than her 3 months at Mercy General. The recognition terrified him because he understood what it meant. She wasn't running from something. She was running toward anonymity. She was a ghost who decided to be a nurse, and ghosts didn't quit. The call came through dispatch at 14:11 on a Tuesday. Multi-vehicle collision, northbound I-25, mile marker 187. 3 vehicles involved. Military passenger. Penetrating chest trauma. ETA to Mercy General, 6 minutes. The ER transformed in seconds, Trauma Bay 3 activated, supplies mobilized, the surgical team assembling with the coordinated precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. But the energy shifted when the paramedics wheeled in the patient. Colonel James Mitchell, USAF, his flight suit visible beneath the blood-soaked blankets. His chest bore the brutal signature of a seatbelt trauma combined with impact wound, blunt force meeting sharp penetration, the worst kind of injury. The charge nurse, Patricia, pulled his chart and went pale. The color drained from her face like water down a clinical sink. Complex medication history, she said, her voice tight. Blood thinners. Anticoagulants for a previous pulmonary embolism. Aspirin protocol. He's on warfarin, 15 milligrams daily. His INR is, she looked up. His INR is 4.2. Any surgery, any aggressive intervention, he could bleed out on the table. Dr. Sterling took one look at the file and stepped back. Not away. Not casually. Back, with the deliberate movement of a man calculating liability. Not worth it, he announced to the assembled surgical team. His voice had taken on the tone of certainty, the voice of institutional power. His coagulation factors are a nightmare. One wrong move, we're looking at uncontrollable hemorrhage, transfusion reaction, and a malpractice suit that ends careers. Insurance will crucify us. This patient is a liability, not an emergency. Get him stabilized and transfer him to Rocky Mountain Medical. They have the trauma unit resources. We don't have the protocol coverage for this level of complexity. 2 other surgeons examined the chart and nodded. They cited the risk-benefit analysis, the insurance implications, the legal precedent. Liability. 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 The word echoed through the trauma bay like a mantra. No one said the other truth, he was military. Officers didn't admit that part. The colonel's blood pressure dropped from 98 systolic to 84. Then 76. His bleeding was internal, invisible, and accelerating. His heart rate climbed to 124. The monitors beeped their urgent rhythm, and no surgeon would touch him. Megan stood at his bedside. While others backed away, while Dr. Sterling watched from the observation window with his arms crossed like a general surveying a tactical defeat, Megan moved into position. Her eye scanned the colonel's injuries with an expression that made Chen recognize her again, that same calm assessment she'd shown during the code, the kind of triage that came from doing it under fire. She noticed the old shrapnel scars on his shoulder, the pattern she'd seen on dozens of Baghdad casualties. The way the tissue had healed suggested IED fragmentation, probably from a convoy strike. His injuries weren't from this car accident. They were echoes. She reached for his wrist to check his radial pulse, and he opened his eyes. Senior Chief. His voice was barely a whisper, but his eyes had seen the same dust, the same sky. Megan went still for exactly 1 second. Easy, Colonel, she said, and her voice had changed again. Not the broken whisper of a floor nurse apologizing to Dr. Sterling. Not the dangerous quiet of the cafeteria. This was the voice of someone on duty. The voice of a professional. I've got you. Stay with me. The colonel's blood pressure continued to drop. 77 systolic. 72, his internal bleeding was accelerating, and his body was moving into compensatory shock, his heart working faster to pump less blood through an expanding hemorrhage. Megan made a choice. She stayed. She stayed at his bedside while every other caregiver in the room stood at the edges, waiting for the transfer orders, watching the monitors tick down toward the moment when transfer became impossible. she stayed and prepared for emergency intervention because she recognized something Dr. Sterling couldn't see. This colonel was salvageable, and she was the only person in Mercy General who could save him. From the observation window, Dr. Sterling smiled. He believed he was finally about to win his bet. She was about to commit a protocol violation, attempt a procedure beyond her scope, and destroy her career in front of witnesses. She was about to give him exactly what he needed to justify her termination. He pulled out his phone and began typing notes. Unauthorized procedure attempt. Patient in critical condition. Recommend immediate suspension pending investigation. He had no idea that the woman standing at that bedside wasn't a timid floor nurse. He had no idea that the person he'd been trying to break had survived worse than his cruelty in places where the cost of failure wasn't a lawsuit, it was body bags. Megan's hands moved on their own. The I-25 northbound corridor erupted at 14:24 on a Tuesday afternoon. 3 vehicles. A military sedan pinned beneath and Suv's full weight. The colonel, call sign Stryker, 28 years of flight command, had been conscious long enough to hear the paramedics calling his blood pressure aloud like a death countdown. 92/56. 88/49. 75/31. They loaded him into the ambulance without letting him speak, which meant they knew. Penetrating chest wound. Pneumothorax. Internal hemorrhaging. And worse, he was on warfarin from a Baghdad shrapnel injury in 2009, his blood the consistency of water, his medications an alphabetized nightmare that made his case a lawsuit waiting to happen. The ETA was for minutes. Mercy General's trauma bay was being prepped before the ambulance doors even shut. Megan was standing at the medication supply station on floor 3 when the overhead intercom crackled, incoming trauma. Mercy General ER. ETA for minutes. She didn't move immediately. Other nurses spun toward the elevators. Other nurses grabbed trauma supplies and ran. Megan finished counting the 1 mg epinephrine vials, 17 in stock, noted on the clipboard, and only then did she turn toward the stairwell. Her pace was unhurried. Her hands were steady. This was the rhythm she knew. While everyone else moved in panic, she moved in certainty. The ER was a controlled frenzy when she descended. Bay 4 already had its lights blazing. The ultrasound machine positioned on the left. Blood products being pulled from the trauma cooler. Dr. James Chen stood at the center console, his face the particular shade of focused intensity that meant he'd done this 200 times. He glanced up when Megan entered. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. He nodded once. Whatever he suspected about her, whatever he'd pieced together from that coding patient 3 months ago, he was setting it aside now. There was a man dying, and Megan was here, and that was all that mattered. The ambulance backed into the bay at 14:51. 2 paramedics moved with the mechanical precision of people who'd done this since dawn. The colonel, a mid-50s, silver threading his temples, jaw clenched against pain, was pale as frosted glass. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandage on his left anterior chest. His breathing was shallow, labored. 24 breaths per minute. Way too high. Way too fast. Penetrating trauma to the left side, the lead paramedic reported. Approximately 5 centimeters, appears to have tracked toward the mediastinum. Patient was conscious on scene, now slightly less responsive. BP holding at 78/42. 2 large bore-fors running wide open. Typo negative going in. Megan moved to the bedside. Not the head of the bed where the attending doctor would stand. The left side. Her position was deliberate, strategic. She could see the chest wound, the 4 sights, and she could feel the patient's neck veins. The second thing she noticed was the medical alert bracelet. The first was the boots. Combat boots. Dusty. Scarred. The kind that had walked desert fire. Dr. Sterling arrived like a storm front, his white coat still buttoned, his expensive watch catching the overhead lights. He positioned himself at the colonel's head without greeting anyone. "All right, what do we have?" "Speak." "Penetrating chest wound, Left side, Dr. Chen said. Possible mediastinal involvement. BP 78/42 and dropping. Patient on warfarin. History of Baghdad-related injuries. Multiple drug sensitivities noted in his medical alert. Dr. Sterling's face tightened. He looked at the colonel's chest, then at his wrist, reading the alert. His jaw moved once, twice. Then he stepped back. "Who's his surgeon?" "You are," Dr. Chen said quietly. "No." Dr. Sterling turned toward the door. "Call Dr. Rajesh. He's trained in thoracic trauma. He can handle the complications." "Dr. Rajesh is in surgery," another resident offered. "Dr. Hartwell is scrubbed in. Dr. Morrison is." "Then get them Dr. Sterling stopped himself. He lowered his voice. "No. This is too complex. Warfarin means his coagulation cascade is already compromised. If we crack his chest and there's mediastinal involvement, we're looking at catastrophic hemorrhage. His medication history alone is a liability nightmare. I'm not taking this case." The room didn't go silent. Monitors kept beeping. Ventilators kept whooshing. But something inside the space changed. The air pressure altered. Megan felt it shift like a physical force. The colonel's eyes found hers. He was scared. Smart enough to know he was about to run out of time, but still scared. She recognized that fear because she'd seen it in mirror reflections outside forward surgical tents, in the faces of men who understood that their survival depended on someone's willingness to try. Dr. Sterling was still talking. "I'm calling the legal team. We need to get this documented. The patient declined treatment by the trauma surgeon due to medication contraindications. Make sure that's in the chart. His blood pressure is 72/38, Megan said. Her voice was level. Not a question. Not a request. Dr. Sterling glanced at her the way someone glances at a coffee maker in a kitchen, something in the periphery, not important. "This doesn't concern you, nurse." "His heart rate is 142, she continued. "His neck veins are distending. He's showing signs of—" "I said this doesn't concern you." Dr. Sterling turned away, already reaching for his phone. The colonel's monitors squealed. A single high-pitched alarm that made every person in the room go absolutely still. His blood pressure bottomed out. 64/28. The kind of number that meant minutes, not hours. His oxygen saturation began to drop. 92. 88. 84. His heart rate climbed. 160. 180. The rhythm on the monitor became irregular, the waveforms flattening like a city skyline viewed from far away. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling his pericardial sac. His own heart was drowning in it. Nobody moved. Dr. Sterling stood frozen with his phone half raised. The resident froze. The nurses froze. Everyone was looking at monitors, looking at the patient, looking at each other, waiting for someone with the authority to make a decision, and the decision was already being made by the physics of hemorrhage. Megan walked to the ultrasound machine. Her movements were precise, practiced, the kind of movements that come from muscle memory and something deeper than conscious thought. She positioned the probe, found the fluid collection in the pericardial space, dark gray on the screen, blood collecting like a slow-motion drowning. She looked at Dr. Chen. "I need a 14-gauge angiocath and a syringe." "Megan," Dr. Chen started. "Now, doctor." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Something in her voice, something that had been buried for 3 months under fluorescent lights and hospital protocol and the careful construction of normalcy, surfaced for exactly the seconds it took to save a life. Dr. Chen moved. The angiocath was in her hand before the colonel's next breath. Megan prepped the skin below his xiphoid process with betadine, the orange-brown color blooming across white skin like a stain spreading. She angled the needle at 30 degrees, just the way it was done in field hospitals outside Fallujah when a man's heart was failing and there were no surgeons and the only thing standing between life and death was the person willing to try. The needle went in. Smooth. Controlled. The kind of entry that comes from having done it dozens of times, in tents and helicopters and vehicles that were moving while explosions bloomed in the distance. The syringe filled with blood. 90 milliliters. Her hands didn't shake. The colonel's oxygen saturation climbed back up. 90. 94. 97. His heart rate dropped to 130. 115. 108. His blood pressure rose like a resurrection. 86 over 52. 92 over 60. The monitors, all of them, began singing a different song. Afterward, when the crucial seconds had passed and the colonel's vital signs had stabilized into the range of survivable, Megan gripped the bed rail. Her knuckles turned white. That was the only tremor anyone would see. Not fear. Restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from someone who has held her composure while mortars fell and dust mixed with blood and the calculus of triage meant choosing who lived and who didn't. This was nothing. This was a Tuesday afternoon and a patient with a pulse. Dr. Chen stared at her. His suspicions had crystallized into certainty. He'd seen this exact procedure performed once before, in a forward surgical tent outside Fallujah, performed by someone with the rank on her shoulder strap and a silver star in her medical file. But she wasn't finished. Megan requested specific labs, a comprehensive metabolic panel, PT-CNR to assess his warfarin levels, type and cross for 6 units of packed cells. She adjusted the 4 drip rates with the precision of someone who understood not just the mechanics of fluid replacement but the physiology of a man whose chest injury meant every milliliter had to be accounted for. She positioned herself at his bedside and stayed there, moving only to check monitors, to request additional labs, to make small adjustments that kept his condition stable. 1 hour passed. 2 hours. 3. Megan didn't leave. Other nurses rotated, took breaks, went on shift changes. Megan remained. Her feet were planted. Her eyes tracked every fluctuation on the screens. When his blood pressure dipped to 87, she was already moving toward the 4 setup, adjusting the rate without waiting for an order that would take too long to arrive. When his heart rate climbed to 122, she requested an EKG and had it placed before the resident could move. She was running a parallel version of his care, the kind of care that only happened in places where you learn to anticipate collapse because collapse came fast. At hour 4, his heart rate finally stabilized. 103. The rhythm on the monitor, sinus. Strong. The blood pressure had climbed to 108 over 68. The oxygen saturation held at 98%. By hour 6, he was sleeping. His breathing had relaxed into the rhythm of someone who would survive the night. Megan finally stepped back from the bedside. Her hands had been steady for all 6 hours. Her composure had never cracked. But as she moved away and the other nurses began to transition his care, she felt the weight of those hours settle onto her shoulders like something physical, like armor made of stone. In his office on the 3rd floor, Dr. Sterling was already on his phone. He called Patricia Hensworth, a board member with connections to the state hospital authority. "We have a liability issue. A floor nurse just performed an invasive cardiac procedure without proper oversight." Then he contacted the sparse references Megan had provided on her 3-month-old employment application, asking pointed questions about gaps in her background. Finally, he called outside investigators from the state medical board, beginning to build the case that would suspend her credentials and destroy the anonymity she'd carried like armor. He had no idea what was about to arrive. The colonel's eyes fluttered open at 6:56 a.m., his oxygen saturation holding steady at 94%. The cardiac monitor traced a sinus rhythm, clean, strong, unchanged for the past 3 hours. His bleeding had stopped. His pressure had climbed to 102 over 64. He was going to live, and the hospital staff knew exactly who to thank. Megan had left his bedside at dawn, her scrub soaked through, her hands stained with the metallic copper smell of 6 hours of blood work and emergency medicine performed in a trauma bay that felt more like Baghdad than Denver. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis when his heart began to fail, her hand steady as surgical steel as she drained the blood compressing his cardiac chamber. She'd done it alone. No attending physician present. No supervision. No authorization. By 7:15 a.m., Dr. Sterling had assembled 47 pages of documentation. He sat in his office with 3 board members on a conference call, his voice smooth as oil. Unauthorized procedure. Inadequate supervision. Reckless disregard for protocol. He'd rehearsed this for hours. His Rolex caught the morning light as he gestured at the paperwork, describing Megan's pericardiocentesis in technical terms that made it sound less like life-saving medicine and more like a crime. A floor nurse. Not a physician assistant. Not a nurse practitioner. A floor nurse with no advanced certifications on file, performing a procedure that belongs in an OR with a surgeon present. The board members listened. One of them, Patricia Chen from Risk Management, had already been briefed. Dr. Sterling had called her at 6:22 a.m., before the sun came up, before Megan had even left the colonel's room. He'd also called 3 of her sparse references. A nursing supervisor from a rural clinic in Wyoming. A private practice manager from Boulder. The director of an emergency medicine program where she'd done a brief rotation. What he was looking for, what he'd coached his questions toward, was inconsistency. Gaps. Anything that suggested Megan O'Brien wasn't who she claimed to be. He didn't find what he wanted. Her references were sparse, but they were sterling. No pun intended. She'd worked. She'd left. No drama. No complaints. No trail of destruction. Which meant he'd have to build one himself. By 8:51 a.m., he'd contacted the state medical board and requested a full investigation into Megan's clinical decisions over the past 3 months. By 9:38 a.m., he'd brought in outside investigators, consultants who specialized in scope of practice violations. They were scheduled to review every single procedure Megan had touched since arriving at Mercy General. She didn't know any of this yet. Megan was in the break room, sitting with a cup of cold coffee, when the hospital administrator, Margaret Hobbs, appeared in the doorway. Margaret's expression was neutral. Professional. The kind of face someone wore when they were about to deliver bad news. "Megan, I need you in my office. Right now." The conference room had 5 chairs. Margaret sat at the head of the table. Dr. Sterling sat to her right, his hands folded, his expression one of grave concern. A representative from the hospital's legal department sat across from Megan, with a laptop and a stack of documents. Patricia Chen from Risk Management was on speakerphone. Margaret opened with the kind of language that hospitals use when they're protecting themselves from liability. "Megan, we've received a formal complaint regarding your clinical activities on the night of the colonel's admission. Dr. Sterling has documented a serious concern that you performed a procedure that falls outside your scope of practice as a registered nurse without proper physician supervision." Megan's hands were folded in her lap. Her breathing was steady. She'd been threatened before. Not like this. This wasn't a threat to her body, it was a threat to the one thing she'd built to replace the life she'd left behind. The pericardiocentesis, Margaret continued, while medically successful, represents a violation of hospital protocol and state nursing regulations. Dr. Sterling is recommending immediate credential suspension pending a full investigation. Dr. Sterling leaned forward. His voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "I take no pleasure in this, Megan. But we have standards. We have protocols. We protect our patients by ensuring that medical procedures are performed by qualified personnel under proper supervision." His jaw tightened. Just slightly. "A performance. What you did, regardless of outcome, was reckless." Megan looked at him. Just looked. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the air pressure was dropping. When she finally spoke, her voice was level. The patient would have died. That's not the point, the legal representative said smoothly. The point is, the patient would have died without the procedure, Megan repeated, each word distinct and cold. His pericardium was tamponading his heart. Every surgeon in this hospital refused the case. His pressure was dropping. His oxygen saturation was 67%. The alternative was watching him code and doing nothing. Dr. Sterling's expression didn't change. He'd anticipated this. And a trained physician could have. Could have what? Megan's eyes didn't leave his. Dr. Harrison refused the case. So did Reeves. So did Martinez. You came to the ER yourself and you walked away. So yes, I did the procedure. And I was still doing it at 4:22 a.m. because his condition kept deteriorating. And at 6:44 a.m., he woke up with a sinus rhythm and a blood pressure that would survive the day. Margaret cleared her throat. The issue isn't whether the outcome was positive. The issue is whether the action was within scope. It was within scope to watch him die. Megan's voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. That's what you're telling me? That it was more appropriate to let him code than to perform a procedure that saved his life. Patricia Chen's voice came through the speaker, tinny and official. The hospital has a legal obligation to. Megan stood up. The chair didn't scrape. She was just suddenly vertical, and the dynamic in the room shifted because she'd shifted it. I understand. My credentials are suspended. I assume security will escort me out. Margaret's face went tight. Megan, sit down. Please. We're not finished. But Megan was already moving toward the door. Her scrubs were still stained with the colonel's blood. Her hands smelled like antiseptic and copper. She'd held a man's heart in her medical knowledge and brought him back from the edge, and now they were going to strip her of the credential to do it again. She didn't look back at Dr. Sterling. That would have been satisfaction, and she didn't give him that. Security met her at the locker room. 2 officers, professional and apologetic. She gathered her things, her stethoscope, her name badge, the pair of worn combat boots she'd kept hidden in the bottom of her locker for 5 years, the boots that had walked through Baghdad dust storms and nearly gotten buried under a collapsed building in Jolan district, the boots that smelled like sand and survival and a life she'd promised herself she was done with. She carried them in her hands as she walked out of Mercy General. She didn't change out of her scrubs. She left in uniform, still wearing the identity they'd just revoked. By evening, she was sitting in the Denver VA hospital waiting room. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The place smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee and something else underneath, the smell of people who carried things they couldn't put down. A television on mute played news that nobody was watching. 3 veterans sat scattered around the waiting area, each one isolated by the weight of whatever brought them there. Megan filled out the intake form at a table by the window. Name. Date of birth. Reason for visit. Insurance information. And then the line that had haunted every form she'd filled for 5 years, military service history. Branch. Rank. Dates of service. Her pen hovered over the blank space. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. United States Navy. 18 years of active duty. 5 deployments. 3 Navy Commendation Medals. 2 Bronze Stars for valor in combat operations. A Silver Star for actions in Baghdad in 2018, for holding a trauma facility alone while the compound was under siege, performing emergency surgery on 12 critical operators, keeping them alive until medevac arrived. Hands that had held intestines and hearts and the last moments of men who were going to live because she wouldn't let them die. She'd walked away from all of it 5 years ago. The PTSD had made her feel like a grenade with the pin pulled. Every nightmare was a fresh trigger. Every sudden sound was a mortar round. Every person who wanted to touch her felt like an enemy combatant. The VA had told her that anonymity was sometimes the most powerful healing tool, that shedding the identity that carried the trauma could give her space to rebuild. She believed them. She'd erased Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. She'd become just a floor nurse named Megan at a Denver hospital. She'd hidden the combat boots. She'd left the medals in a storage unit in her sister's basement. She'd told no one where she'd gone or what she'd been. She'd built something new. Something quiet. Something that let her help people without the weight of command on her shoulders. And now they'd taken that too. The pen shook in her hand. Not from fear. From rage. From the recognition that anonymity hadn't saved her, it had just delayed the inevitable moment when she'd have to admit what she was. That the only part of her that mattered was the part she'd been trying to bury. She looked up from the form. Across the waiting room, a man in a wheelchair was staring at her. Marine tattoo. Jaded eyes. Something in his posture that spoke of deserts and danger. His face was unfamiliar out of context, but she recognized the set of his jaw, the way he carried his shoulders even in a wheelchair. She'd pulled shrapnel out of his leg in Baghdad. She'd held a tourniquet on his femoral artery while the building shook around them. He didn't recognize her. Not in scrubs instead of desert camo. Not without the rank insignia. Not without the context of command. She looked back down at the form. Her hand hovered over the military service history line. 5 years of leaving it blank. 5 years of being no one. And now she wondered if that anonymity had cost her the only identity that ever mattered. She didn't write anything. She just sat there, pen suspended over the blank space, while the fluorescent lights hummed and the VA-weighted room breathed around her like a living thing that knew exactly what she was and wouldn't let her pretend otherwise anymore. The rotor wash hit the emergency entrance like artillery fire, shaking the automatic doors so hard they stuck halfway open. The Black Hawk descended toward the parking lot with the precision of something that had landed on aircraft carriers and desert outposts and forward operating bases where every second counted. Boots on asphalt. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 officers in dress blues moved through the hospital corridor like they owned the building, their uniforms immaculate. They're bearing the kind that comes from giving orders that people follow without question. They were looking for someone. In the press conference room on the 3rd floor, Dr. Sterling was mid-sentence, his voice carrying that particular timbre of a man who'd spent decades cultivating authority, a surgeon explaining to reporters why Mercy General needed to implement stronger protocols around scope creep by non-physician staff. His Rolex caught the camera lights. Behind him, a blown-up photo of his face, that practice smile, that tilt of the head that said, "I'm thinking about your problem." The statement had been carefully worded by hospital counsel, designed to position himself as a visionary protecting patient safety. He was explaining how a single, enthusiastic but undertrained nurse had nearly created a catastrophic liability situation when the door opened. The officers didn't knock. It wasn't a request. They walked into the room with the unmistakable weight of federal authority, and the air pressure changed. Dr. Sterling's sentence died on his tongue. The reporters turned. Camera flashes exploded like distant mortars. One officer moved to the podium while Dr. Sterling backed away, his hand instinctively going to his tie. "We're looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien," the officer said. His name tape read Holloway. His voice moved through the room like a weapon that didn't need to be fired. "She works in this hospital." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then everything broke open. Captain Sarah Mitchell pushed through the doors behind them, her Army service dress uniform sharp as a knife edge, her eyes swollen from crying and something else, something like vindication. She was the colonel's daughter. She had her father's jawline, his bearing, his absolute refusal to back down. When she spoke, her voice cracked but didn't break. "My father is alive because Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien was here. She stayed with him for 6 hours while every surgeon in this hospital," her eyes found Dr. Sterling, held them like a targeting laser, refused to touch him. "She performed a pericardiocentesis at bedside under field conditions. She drained blood compressing his heart with her hand steady as a surgical laser." Captain Mitchell took one breath. "She saved his life." A surgical nurse, the same one who'd watched Megan work, who'd whispered in awe at her precision, stepped forward with trembling hands. She was reading from a military file, the kind of document with headers that said classified and official personnel record. Her voice shook as she read, 3 Navy Commendation Medals. She paused. The room absorbed it. 2 Bronze Stars for valor. Another pause. Dr. Sterling's face had gone the color of old parchment. 18 years of active duty service. Honorable discharge pending. The nurse looked at Dr. Sterling. She's a decorated combat veteran. Then Commander Santos stepped forward. He was a SEAL team leader, 3rd Platoon, had flown in from Naval Station Norfolk the moment the colonel regained consciousness and told him who'd saved his life. Santos moved like someone who'd operated in the world's worst places and brought everyone home. His presence made the air pressure change. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded men through fire and had the silver stars to prove it. Senior Chief O'Brien served with distinction in Baghdad, Santos said. His words were precise, military, each one weighted. Fallujah. Sanjan Valley. FOB Shank. She was attached to my team during Operation Enduring Freedom, 2009 through 2012. He looked around the room, at the reporters, at the hospital board members who'd been standing behind Dr. Sterling, at the staff who'd laughed when Sterling made jokes about the timid little floor nurse. During a direct-fire engagement in Helmand Province, she pulled 12 of my operators out of a burning compound under sustained small arms fire. 12 men. All of them survived because she refused to leave anyone behind. Santos pulled an envelope from his jacket. Silver Star. Navy's 3rd highest decoration for valor. She earned it in the worst place on earth so people who'd never met her could go home to their families. The reporters were writing everything down, their cameras never stopping, and Dr. Sterling's lawyer suddenly appeared beside him, whispering something urgent that made his shoulders collapse inward. But it was too late. It was all too late. An FBI agent in a charcoal suit stepped forward. She was holding a file the thickness of a novel, and her voice had the particular flatness of federal authority. Dr. Marcus Sterling, we're executing a warrant regarding federal document falsification and obstruction of justice. She opened the file. Inside were personnel records, Megan's official documents, side by side with forged versions. The handwriting was different. The dates didn't match. The signatures were electronically altered, the kind of fraud that left digital fingerprints. You attempted to falsify Senior Chief O'Brien's personnel file to justify her termination. You contacted 3 federal investigators with false information regarding her credentials. You interfered with an active military background investigation. The agent's eyes were flat, professional, unmoved. That constitutes fraud, obstruction of justice, and interference with a federal security protocol. Dr. Sterling tried to speak. Nothing came out. The handcuffs clicked with a sound like a rifle bolt chambering around. Metal against metal, a sound that echoed through the press conference room and down the corridors of Mercy General where he'd walked for 23 years, where he'd made residents cry and nurses doubt themselves and junior surgeons learn his particular brand of hierarchy. The officers moved him toward the door with the efficient, practice motion of people who'd done this before, and Dr. Sterling's Rolex caught the light one last time before he disappeared into the hallway. The hospital's general counsel was already making calls, and by evening, Mercy General had issued a press statement. Dr. Sterling's employment was terminated effective immediately. By the next morning, the State Medical Board had opened an ethics investigation. Within a week, the Colorado Springs Gazette ran the headline, "Prominent Denver Surgeon Arrested for Falsifying Military Heroes' Records." Within 2 weeks, his colleagues stopped returning his calls. The medical community was small, interconnected, a network built on reputation and trust, and no one wanted to be seen with a surgeon who'd fabricated evidence against a decorated combat veteran. His criminal trial lasted 6 weeks. He pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges in exchange for a suspended sentence, but the medical board wasn't interested in suspended anything. They revoked his license permanently. 34 years of surgical practice, gone. His malpractice insurance dropped him. His hospital privileges vanished. The Rolex sold for $38,000 to a collector in San Francisco who didn't know its history. 2 years later, someone from the old surgical team spotted him in a community college classroom in Aurora, teaching CPR to bored students who didn't know who he'd been. Dr. Sterling was demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his hands trembling slightly, his voice trying to carry authority but falling short, like a recording of authority rather than the real thing. Minimum wage. No title. No white coat. Just a man showing young people how to push on a plastic chest and hope the real ones came back to life. The former colleague watched for a moment, then turned and walked away. Dr. Sterling saw them go and said nothing. At Mercy General, Megan's credentials were fully restored with a formal hospital commendation. The board created a new protocol allowing experienced combat medics to practice at an expanded scope under appropriate supervision, turning her 5 years of hiding into institutional policy that would save lives for decades to come. The ceremony happened on a Saturday morning in late September. The parking lot of Mercy General transformed into something between a hospital honor and a military standing ceremony. A platform had been erected near the emergency entrance, the exact spot where the colonel had arrived bleeding, where Megan had made the choice that ended everything and began everything else. She stood in her navy dress blues for the first time in 5 years, the uniform hanging on her differently than it once had, looser somehow, as if she'd become smaller while the uniform stayed the same size. The ribbons across her chest caught sunlight like small flags. 3 Navy Commendation Medals. 2 Bronze Stars. 1 Silver Star. The medal she'd earned in places most people couldn't locate on a map, for things most people couldn't imagine surviving. Her worn combat boots were retired now, resting in a shadow box on her apartment wall next to a framed photo of her team in Baghdad, their faces young and alive and forever 23. Polished dress shoes replaced them, leather so shined it reflected clouds. Colonel Mitchell stood on the platform, recovered and upright, his own uniform fitted perfectly, his hand steady as he gripped Megan's shoulder. Captain Mitchell saluted. Commander Santos stood at attention with 11 other operators, the 12 men she'd carried out of Fallujah, now lined up behind her in formal dress, a silent guard of honor that said, "We remember what you did. We remember who you are." When Dr. Chen approached her after the ceremony, he asked the question that everyone was thinking, "Why did you hide?" Megan looked at the 12 operators standing in formation, at the hospital rising behind them, at the emergency entrance where she'd chosen to stay instead of walk away. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It wasn't the deferential whisper of a floor nurse anymore. It was the voice of someone who'd commanded, who'd been trusted with lives, who'd learned that authority didn't come from a title but from what you were willing to do when the moment demanded it. "I needed to prove I was more than the worst thing that happened to me," she said. "I needed to know I could save lives without a war forcing me to. That I could be useful without the adrenaline, without the mission, without everything stripped down to survival." She took a breath that moved through her body like a release of pressure, the kind of breath that comes when you finally stop holding on. "I needed to heal." For the first time since Baghdad, since the mortars and the screaming and the nightmares that had driven her to anonymity, Megan O'Brien felt like she could breathe. Not the shallow breathing of someone hiding. Not the accelerated breathing of someone in crisis. Real breathing. The kind that meant you were alive and you knew it and you didn't have to apologize for it anymore. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've ever hidden who you really were to survive, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, would you have revealed yourself, or would you still be hiding? And if you know someone serving in the medical field who deserves recognition, tag them right now. Let them know they matter. They're watching. They're always listening. And sometimes, the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.